Now, let's discuss part 2 of this lecture, beginning with legal improvements and new horizons. And we begin with higher education. And we focus first on Britain, and then we'll expand the scope to the US later on at the end of this second video. Queen's College, that still exists to this day, was opened as an Anglican foundation for women in the middle of the 19th century, but it was run by men. Therefore, it's worth mentioning that Bedford College, opened a year later, was run by women themselves. Or we could mention another example, Girton College in Cambridge, that was the first residential college for women undergrads. So we see gradual improvements in the second half of the 19th century. But that being said, the higher professions, lawyers, doctors, professors at university, not teachers in schools, but professors at university, these remains jobs that were accessible mainly to men. For instance, in 1914, women just formed 6% of that number of people who had higher professions. Now, what is ideal at this point is to listen to a Victorian woman discussing how things change, how things were when she was a young girl in the 1870s, 1880s, in the late 19th century, and how things changed throughout her lifetime. So even better than me going on about how things changed, let's listen to Florence discuss how her life was transformed.
Now let's meet someone who can bring a little history to us. Her name is Mrs. Florence Pannell, and she's 108 years old. Unlike most women of her time, Florence Pannell managed to set up her own beauty care business. She worked for many years in Paris and in London, and she knows a great deal about fashion. Florence, tell me, was it all right for a lady to show her ankle?
In Paris, nothing mattered. But I'm speaking of years before that. Years. When I suppose I was about 10.
Yes.
There was a cartoon in Punch of the old-fashioned bus with the seats going parallel with the bus. And all the men going like this.
Yes. What were they looking for?
There was a woman crossing the road and holding her dress up and showing her ankle to there.
Tut. Florence,
Yes.
tell me a bit about how you managed to start your own beauty business.
No lady worked in those days. It was only a companion or a teacher. She could be a hospital nurse. But not private.
So it was difficult.
Oh, for women, shockingly difficult. I can tell you a story about that. That was also, I think, in Punch. A scraggy woman seated in a chair, little girl playing on the floor, about 4 years old, and an awful-looking man this side in an armchair. Mother, when I grow up, shall I have to be married? Yes, dear. Shall I have to marry a man like father? Yes, dear. And if I don't marry him, shall I be an old maid like Aunt Eliza? Yes, dear. Silence for a minute. Say, Mother, it's a hard world for us women, isn't it?
Have you ever been in an aeroplane?
Never.
Would you like to?
I shouldn't mind now, but I wouldn't when they first came in. I never fancied them. But I would now because I'm more venturesome.
I think you've been very adventurous right through your life. What's the biggest change of all you've seen?
The biggest change, everything. Nothing is the same. Everything is changed.
Now, it's important to note that until 1870 and 1882, it was a two-step legislation. Married women's property and earnings automatically passed on to their husbands once they were indeed the wives of their husbands. So in terms of property, it was very limited for married women, at least until the second half of the 19th century. There was also the question of children. There was an act that was passed in 1839 allowing women to take custody of their children under the age of 7 if they got divorced or separated. But it's worth noting that if they had committed adultery, then that couldn't be the case. Divorce was allowed as a civil matter, not a religious matter, but a civil matter. But there was a double standard. The husband was allowed to divorce on the grounds of adultery, meaning that he was allowed to get a divorce because the wife had committed adultery, but that wasn't the case for women, and we see that double standard once again. In the US, there were changes in employment as well, transformation that started in the first half of the 19th century and carried on. For instance, just like in Britain, women could work in shops as clerks in department stores. There were teachers, for instance. Look into the life of Catherine Beecher, if you're curious about that. There were doctors. Look into the life of Elizabeth Blackwell, the first American female physician. And there were also women who were pioneers in the field of law, like Arabella Mansfield, the first American woman to be licensed to practice law in the second half of the 19th century. So there were changes in employment in the US as well. But what women started to demand are political rights. And we get to the question of suffragists and suffragettes. Let us begin in Britain before jumping in the US. Maybe you've heard of Mary Wollstonecraft's seminal book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is interesting because it's an 18th century book, admittedly late 18th century. But it's a book that attempts to vindicate, to claim the rights of women. Now, in the early 19th century, there was a Reform Act that was passed. It was an act that gave the right to vote to more men in Britain. Not all men, not a lot of men, really, even though it's called Great, it's nicknamed Great. It made a difference, not a huge difference, but it made a little bit of a difference for men, for upper middle class men. Working class men could not vote because there were property questions that meant that you could or not vote. You had to be wealthy, just to simplify things. But ever since the moment that the vote was open just a little bit more to men, there were calls for women to also get the same rights. But many people thought that politics was just too abstract for women. That being said, in the 1860s, when there was another Reform Act, yet again expanding the number of men who could vote, several women decided to create suffrage societies in the hopes of promoting the cause of female suffrage. They were backed mostly by women, but sometimes by men. And here it's worth mentioning John Stuart Mill. He wrote a book called The Subjection of Women, in which he compares wives and their relations with their husbands to the lives of slaves. And he argued, which is very much ahead of his time. He argued that what was called woman's nature, what was seen as a biological fact of life, was actually artificial, was actually cultural, in the sense that it was gender, not sex. Now, there were conflicts within those groups of suffrage societies. At the end of the 19th century, we see a split between those who wanted to get the right to vote using constitutional means, the suffragists. Groups like the NUWSS, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Skip the acronym, but remember the notion of constitutional means. Versus those who believed that constitutional methods would never lead anywhere, or at least not quickly enough, and therefore they had much more militant actions, like, for instance, setting a letterbox on fire or throwing a stone in a shop window. These were the suffragettes. The word itself was used as an insult at first against women seen as suffragettes. It's belittling, like et meaning little. But then it was seen as something that they wanted to own, use that very label that was initially designed to mock them and make it their own. That was the case of the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union. It's worth noting that Britain lagged behind, that England, Wales, Scotland, the UK basically lagged behind New Zealand, a Dominion, where all women got the right to vote in parliamentary elections in the late 19th century. Couldn't stand for it, but they could vote. Or we could also mention Australia in 1902, which was pointed out in the UK by people fighting for women to get the right to vote. But there was an anti-suffrage movement. And in the anti-suffrage movements, there were women. It's worth, for instance, mentioning the example of Mrs. Mary Humphrey Ward. She's a famous female writer, so she was very much a public figure, not a domestic creature. But she became the head of the Anti-Suffrage League in 1908, arguing that, yes, it was good that women had more rights. So she wasn't totally against, for instance, women having jobs and being out in the public sphere, but against women's right to vote. We could also mention how sometimes medical scientists meddled with this topic. For instance, one in particular describing the suffragettes as sexually embittered and blaming their anger on them not having a partner. So you can see that there was a clash between those groups. Now, before you continue, remember that on Moodle, you'll find a series of slides. It's slides that feature postcards arguing against the movement for female suffrage. And on the slides that you checked out with the prep work, you'll find notes on the analysis of those anti-suffrage postcards and anti-suffrage posters. The fight leads us to the moment when women got the right to vote, of course. When the war started, the suffragettes stopped their actions, feeling that there was a need for the country to be unified against a common enemy. Women played an active part during the war, challenging certain stereotypes, and many historians believe that this experience brought them the votes quicker perhaps than it would have happened without the war. Whatever the situation is, in 1918, all men were given the votes over the age of 21, but women got the vote, but not all women. We see that there is still inequality between the two with that Representation of the People Act. The women who got the right to vote were had to be older than men, and they had to meet certain property requirements. It's only in 1928 that the Equal Franchise Act brought women and men on the same level. Now, what about American women? Some reformers started to campaign for the emancipation of slaves as early as in the 1830s. Remember, eventually things escalated with the Civil War in the 1860s. What's the link with female suffrage? Many women joined the anti-slavery movement, became very active, and slavery could be seen by these women as a metaphor to describe their situations. Women organized in 1848 a women's rights convention with 300 men and women meeting to make demands for more equality, whether it be in politics, but also in social life and in economic life. They wrote a declaration of sentiments that uses that famous all men are created equal line, changing it into all men and women are created equal. Amongst the famous women who attended this particular conference, there was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, but also Frederick Douglass, a famous figure of the abolitionist movements in the US. Suffrage societies were created. The suffrage societies merged eventually towards the late 19th century with fundamental figures of the movement like Sojourner Truth, Ida Wells, Susan B. Anthony, for instance, to name but a few, just for the sake of, it not taking forever. But there are many more that could be mentioned that would be worth mentioning. You have to remember that the US has a federal state, but also states that have their own legislation. So the suffrage was first granted in certain states, like Wyoming, for instance, very early on in 1869. And then gradually it extended to other states. Eventually, an amendment was passed to guarantee that all women throughout the US, no matter which state they lived in, would be allowed to vote. So in 1920, the Constitution, the 19th Amendment, stipulated that the right to vote could not be limited on account of sex. However, of course, it's worth mentioning that not all women could vote. For instance, it was almost impossible for African American women to vote because, it was also almost impossible for African American men to vote. So this is, a picture that needs quite a lot of nuance. And we've arrived at the end of today's discussion. I hope that you enjoyed the videos. I hope that you enjoyed the contents of the videos. Feel free to ask all of the questions that you may have using the Moodle forum. Take care of yourselves.